On September 12, 1999, I found myself driving 300 miles from my home in Palm Desert, California to St. George, Utah, where I'd be making a presentation to a group of men who would hopefully become my new clients. My wife and I arrived in St. George and we checked into our hotel, and then I walked across the street to the motel. There I met one of the elderly men I was going to meet with, Mr. Harold Poole. We went into the conference room, and I waited. And then the men came in. They came in one at a time. One man was hooked up to an oxygen machine. One had a cane, another a walker, and the others shambled in, which was appropriate for their age, and some of them had their wives with them. As I looked them in the eye and shook their hands, I realized that there was something profoundly different about these men, different than any other clients I'd ever had, and quite frankly, different from any other group of people that I'd ever met. The meeting was called to order. Harold stood up and introduced me, and I began the presentation. As I stood before the group, it became apparent that I didn't really need to explain World War II to them. They'd lived it. I told them that some 55 years ago, they'd been taken prisoners of war by the Japanese, and then they were forced into slave labor by private Japanese corporations. In 1999, California passed a statute that allowed these men to file lawsuits against those Japanese corporations who made a profit off of the slave labor that they performed. After the questions were asked and I did the best I could to answer them, the meeting was adjourned. And then Harold Poole and I went back to his small motel room. And I asked him about his experience during World War II. And then he began to tell me the story of what happened to him and the men that were on the Philippine Islands.
Up and down, back and forth on him. And sure enough, by the time he pulled out of his dive and passed through, he was on fire.
I walked out of Harold's room, and as I walked across the street, it dawned on me that this case was going to be significantly different than any other case I'd ever handled. After the very first meeting with the men, I knew that no matter how the case turned out, whether we won or we lost or whatever, that there was a remarkable story in the case, and it was a story that I knew I wanted to tell, and that's why I immediately got a hold of Lee Benson and said, Lee, I want you to participate in writing a book with me. Now that we've finished the case, I've decided to go out and use the book as a teaching tool. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to go out today to speak to a local high school is because I'm going to tell a story that these kids have never heard. And I think it's important for the young people to know the history. And I owe it to the men, after becoming a part of their life, to make sure that their story was told, that they're not forgotten. And I think these children, and I call them children because they're the ages of, they're much younger than I am, that they find out what a real hero is, that they get a role model, not some nonsense that the media wants to expose them to, but real American heroes who have a responsibility, then when called upon, rise up and fulfill their destiny. I want the kids to hear that, and I want them to be familiar not only with Harold Poole, but with all the men. I was very interested in finding out what they're teaching in the local high schools about World War II and about Bataan and the Bataan Death March. So I went to one of the local high schools here in the Coachella Valley in Southern California, and they gave me this book, American History, the Modern Era Since 1865. It's a book of over 900 pages, so I went to the index, and they referred me to page 589, and it's Japanese Victories in the Pacific. Bataan Death March, the Battle of Manila, the slave labor, everything is 15 words, one sentence. When I go different places and I'm with the so-called academic elite and I tell them that I'm going to high schools and this is where I feel the most comfortable, they all kind of look at me a little askance and go, "You got to be kidding me. You can talk about World War II, you can talk about a book you wrote in politics and law to high school students?" As a lawyer, you get involved in cases. They're just not cases, they involve people with real problems. And today I'm going to introduce you to a client by the name of Harold Poole, who is a World War II survivor and the person I wrote my book about. And quite candidly, the reason I share his story is because meeting him and understanding what happened to him and how he chose to live his life literally changed my own life.
I am not a hero. People call me that, but my true title is I'm a well-blessed survivor. I put the credit where the credit is due. I'm only here because of our good Lord and for the blessings that I've received. I don't look upon myself as any hero. All I did was what I was supposed to do and hoped I could have done more. This is the one that... Well, this is my military one. This is me at recruit training, Hamilton Field. I enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps August the 30th, 1940 at Fort Douglas, Utah, because there was such unrest in the world, and Germany and England were already at war, and Germany had sunk some of our supply ships we were sending to England, and it looked like we'd be into it before long. And I was anxious to get in and do my part. And so when I was at the Union Pacific train depot in Salt Lake City with my family, and they were seeing me off, and they were a bit apprehensive because basically I was going off to war, and they knew that. And so to relieve the tension there, I said, "Hey, I've been assigned to go down to Hamilton Field, California, which is just a few miles north of San Francisco on the bay, to get my recruit training." I says, and this is 1st of September, I'll get a furlough and come home for Christmas.
When Harold Poole said goodbye to his family, he knew that along with the other members of his group, he was going to be ordered to the Philippine Islands. What he didn't know is that he wasn't going to see his family again for another 5 years.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost.
Hours later that same day, the Japanese attacked the Philippines.
We're eating breakfast when somebody came in and announced Pearl Harbor's been bombed. And well, that can't happen. And we didn't really take it too serious at first. But then we had the sirens go off in the field, which meant that every crew chief had to get out on the line and see that the job was done. My plane was scheduled to take off at 1 o'clock for a training flight. And I was on the field a little before 12 and had the plane ready to go and all. We were all lined up, everything was like it was supposed to be. Airplanes all clean, shiny. And just as the pilots were getting into the plane, some of them had already started the taxi. Somebody saw, look at that flight of planes. We looked up, and boy, there was a big flight of planes. I have no idea how many, and all of a sudden, all heck broke loose.
I remember running to the door to see what happened. I was in my shorts and T-shirt, and I looked up and I could see there was, I think, about 54 airplanes coming over, and all of a sudden I heard bombs dropping. Now, that was my first experience of the war, and all I remember is falling to the ground and trying to get as close to it as I can.
I looked up and saw the red dots on the wings. I said, gee, God, this is war. And in the next half hour, they completely wiped out Clark Field. All but 4 of our aircraft were shot down. It went on for approximately 2 hours. It just came in waves. And there was really nothing left of Clark Field. The hangars had been bombed and strafed.
We lost an awful lot of our people. Our planes had been out flying all morning and come back in, and we're in the process of refueling when all this happened. And a number of our pilots were killed on takeoff runs, very similar to what happened to Pearl Harbor on December 7th.
After these first bombers went over, in came a bunch of dive bombers, single-engine bombers, and they were down low right across the airfield, strafing and hitting everything that was left that the bombers didn't get. And at this particular time, I had jumped into a foxhole, and that was there by the operations shack. And in this foxhole, there was a .30 caliber Lewis air-cooled machine gun mounted on a steel post. And I'd never fired a machine gun, but I was an armament man. I worked with the guns. That was my job. And I'd taken them apart and cleaned them before, and I knew how to do that, so I did that. I tried to fire this gun when they were flying down across that field, and it was jammed. So I took it down off the post, set it on my lap down in the hole, and took it apart and cleaned it and put it back together, what they call field stripping. And this time I tried it and it worked. By then there was one diving on me, and so I started firing at him, and I didn't have any tracers in it, and I couldn't tell where I was hitting. So I just went up and down and back and forth on him. And sure enough, by the time he pulled out of his dive, when he passed me, he was on fire. And that was the end of him. Well, I did receive a Silver Star for that later on, and because I'd never fired a machine gun and wasn't assigned to it. And it was really an exciting thing for me to happen. In fact, the most exciting thing in my life that I'd had happen to me.
After the bombing raid was over, we all gathered back on the field and just talking amongst ourselves, what happened? Why did this happen? Why weren't we warned and things like this? But of course, didn't do any good at that time. We stayed on Clark Field till the Christmas Day of 1941. And then we, by truck, were taken into Bataan Peninsula, clear down to Marvelis, where there was another airfield there, just a small, just big enough for pursuit planes, although we did have a couple of B-18s that landed once in a while, but that was all.
That's where we did our fighting, because all the Allied forces were ordered to go back on this peninsula and hold it. because it was a smaller area to hold. Our front line was just at the top end of the peninsula. And we fought for 4 months, and we got orders right away from General MacArthur to hold these bases because we have airplanes, we have hundreds of ships and thousands of men and airplanes on their way to help you.
Reinforcements were never ordered to the Philippine Islands, and they were never intended to be sent. A decision had been made at the highest levels of our government that the emphasis would be on the European theater and not on the Pacific theater. President Roosevelt personally ordered General MacArthur off of Corregidor Island, and the men felt totally abandoned by their leaders when they found out the next morning that General MacArthur and his wife and child had boarded a PT boat and fled to Australia.
We had been on starvation rations along, and this was in January. They cut our rations in half, and they cut our rations in half again. And we were hungry all the time. We were down to 1 meal a day when all this happened.
April 3rd was the all-out offense. That's when the Japanese decided to come in totally. And on April 3rd, they started to come down with thousands and thousands of troops. It got so bad that our machine guns would fire, and the machine gun barrel would actually go like this from the heat. And then we would have to withdraw. We couldn't stay there, and the Japanese would just keep coming. It was awful. And on April 9th, our general on Bataan, which was General King, issued the order to all members on Bataan to stop fighting, to surrender. General King said, "There's no way, I cannot allow the slaughter to continue on." By that time, we had no food left. We had very little ammunition, if any. We didn't have the medicine. The men were sick. The men were wounded. And General King said, "I cannot allow the slaughter to continue." And on April 9th, the surrender came. And he gave instructions for everybody to disband and destroy their arms, destroy the trucks, destroy everything we had. It was a sad day. And when I mean sad day, I saw the white flag and I realized what was happening. I was told that we had to surrender. I was sad. I wasn't sad in terms of being afraid or scared. Hell, I didn't know what was coming. I was just sad because the Americans had surrendered. And today, as I think about it, one of the saddest points of my life today is the fact that the worst defeat the United States military has ever had was on Bataan. And no one knows about Bataan.
Now, how did a lawyer in 1999 get involved with a bunch of soldiers from World War II? Briefly, a law passed in California in 1999 that said that if you were used as slave labor either in Europe or in Japan during the war, you could sue the corporations that used you for slave labor for your back wages with interest. You could sue the companies in California if they were doing business there. And so a group of us did just that. Lawyers from Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Jackson, Mississippi, San Diego, Palm Desert, California, we all got together and we pooled our funds to take on these giant Japanese corporations. The very first case that we filed was the case of Lester Tenney.
When I was in the hospital at Schick General Hospital, I wrote a letter to the State Department. And I asked the State Department what I could do to recover from the Japanese and the companies that I was put into forced labor and the beatings that they gave me. And the State Department wrote me back a letter saying, "Don't worry, we're taking care of everything for you, and we'll let you know." And of course, in 1990, I still hadn't heard anything. That was 55 years. My book came out in 1995, if I remember correctly. And a lot of people read it for the first time and said, my God, I didn't know those things happened. And although you would like to have a lawsuit, you can't because the statute of limitations has expired. And I said, well, that's the way it goes. Until all of a sudden, the state of California introduced a bill into their Senate. It was going to give anyone that was tortured or put into forced labor by Germany or their allies, includes Japan then, doesn't it? That the statute of limitations was going to be extended to the year 2010. Hey, the statute of limitation is going to be extended. That means I can have a lawsuit.
Lester Tenney took his case to attorney David Casey in San Diego, California. It soon spread to other lawyers across the country, and the number of clients began to expand. By the end of the case, we had individual clients totaling over 800, and also thousands in the class action lawsuits. Our legal team researched the history, the treaty, specifically the Treaty of 1951, and all the evidence that we had looked at indicated that we had a strong case.
Now, it was highly unusual that our firm took this case on a contingency fee basis, which meant we were only going to be paid if we succeeded. But everybody believed so strongly in this. And the other thing to remember, this was coming on the heels of a major success for the lawyers who had advocated on behalf of the Holocaust survivors. They had filed similar actions in court, and in fact, one of the judges asked the Department of Justice to intervene, and the Department of Justice wrote a letter back saying, we won't intervene.
The Holocaust cases had received the aid of the U.S. government and the German government. That case would later settle for approximately $8 million in favor of approximately 1.5 million recipients. We had no reason to believe that our case would be treated any differently by the United States government. We started with Lester Tenney's lawsuit against Mitsui, and it was followed by approximately 11 other lawsuits, naming defendants Mitsubishi, Nippon Steel, Ishihara Sangyo, and 25 other individual defendant corporations.
We filed these cases, and the first one's in August of 1999. Then in the spring of 2000, we discovered for the first time that the U.S. government was going to file a statement of interest in our cases. And we were surprised at this. The first inkling we got of that was a letter, I believe, from Madeleine Albright, who was then the Secretary of State, to Senator Hatch, and saying, you know, hey, we're the State Department, and we think the treaty foreclosed these claims. And so, as a result of that, Senator Hatch held hearings, and I believe they were the mid part of 2000. And he had two representatives from the State Department. One of them was the legal advisor, Mr. Bettauer. Mr. Bettauer came to that hearing and said, well, it's obvious that this is what the treaty means. These private versus private claims were espoused by our government, and they are now foreclosed.
I intend to address briefly the 1951 Treaty of Peace with Japan and why the State Department asked the Department of Justice to file a statement of interest in favor of removal of the lawsuits to federal court. Article 14B of the 1951 Treaty of Peace with Japan provides that, and I'll quote it, except as otherwise provided in the treaty, the Allied powers waive all reparations claims of the Allied powers, other claims of the Allied powers, and their nationals arising out of any action taken by Japan and its nationals in the course of the prosecution of the war.
Is that the language you're basically relying on then?
That's the basic language, yes.
But how can the government waive the rights of individuals?
Well, I will talk a little bit about
shouldn't have interrupted.
how this occurred.
I can see how the government can waive its rights. I can see how it can enter into a treaty. I can see how it can do all of that. But what bothers me is how can that, without the consent of the individual citizens, waive the rights of individual citizens who have been mistreated?
The government has had the power to address the claims and settle the claims against foreign nations of citizens for some 200 years under our system.
That's right. If they actually take up the claims of the citizens and actually settle them for the benefit of the citizens, then yeah, I could see where that would apply. But here it seems to me they've just ignored the claims of the citizens other than the $1.50 a day.
Well, I think you have to look at what the treaty intended to accomplish as a whole. And
yeah, but I looked at the treaty, and I don't see the language in there that forecloses individual suits for reparations. That's where I'm having some difficulty.
Well,
I'm not trying to give you a rough time. I just want to...
This treaty, by its terms, settles all war-related claims of the United States
so what?
And its nationals, and precludes the possibility of taking...
You mean the federal government? You mean our federal government can just say, to hell with you, Bataan Death Marchers, and you people who were mistreated, we're just going to waive all your rights because we have the almighty power to do so.
It was a decision made in 1950. In the 1950s.
I don't care about the decision. I'm saying, can the federal government do that?
Yes, I think the federal government
and actually take away their rights without giving them a chance to be heard.
That is, I think, an established authority of the federal government.
There was another section of the treaty which said if the Japanese, after signing this treaty, gave a better deal to any of the signatories of the treaty, they then had to offer that same better deal to all the signatories.
And let me just read the Most Favored Nations Clause of Article 26. Should Japan make a peace settlement of war claims settlement with any state, granting that state greater advantages than those provided by the present treaty, those same advantages shall be extended to the parties to the present treaty. Now, my question then is, has Japan provided more favorable terms to other nations in connection with settlements of war claims than you now assert were provided in the 1951 treaty?
There are a number of other treaties that Japan has with other nations, because this was a multilateral peace treaty, and Japan was encouraged to conclude peace treaties with those who weren't party to it. And there are some claims provisions in some of those peace treaties. But looking at those...
That are more favorable.
No, it's impossible to say, because you have to know what the claims of the other countries were, what the...
We knew as a fact, through our research and the treaty experts on our team's research, that Japan had actually paid additional compensation to former POWs from a number of places. That clearly, we felt, opened the door to U.S. POWs receiving additional compensation.
Settling up after a war is not an easy thing. Could they not be urged, in the light of their economic progress and strength, to, whether legally required or not, to consider compensating these people who suffered?
Well, I mean, it is possible to urge.
I couldn't help but wonder if the State Department was more interested in protecting its relationship with Japan than it was in seeking justice for these American soldiers.
There is never a time in the United States State Department where it isn't a sensitive time to raise an issue with another country. Never. When you approach the particular desk at the State Department, whether it's the Jamaica desk or the Argentina desk or the Japan desk, 100% of the time you will hear it's a very sensitive time. And they will tell you the 3 or 4 things that are happening that month between the United States and that country that make it a sensitive time. The State Department was absolutely unwilling to take on the Japanese government on an issue that was sensitive to the Japanese government.
The State Department met with representatives of the Japanese companies at issue here, or with the Japanese government concerning this matter, or with both? And if so, when and how often?
I'm not aware of whether we have met with representatives of the Japanese companies on that. We can get that information for you for the record.
Okay.
I know that
when the
State Department meets with
the survivors of the Bataan Death March and of this inhumane treatment by the Japanese and by those companies testified, I think everybody in the hearing room was moved by it. And I actually thought that perhaps it would even change the opinions of the representatives of the State Department, but they had a job to do, and they weren't going to change their opinions, even though I think deep down they wished they could have.
Into labor for Nippon Steel.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you, Senator Hatch, for your kind remarks in introducing me. As previously indicated, my name is Harold Woodpool. I'm an 81-year-old widower living in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm here to ask for your help as I seek justice not only for me, but for all of us who served and suffered, both living and dead. Justice has long been delayed, but it must not be denied.
I was forced to shovel coal 12 hours a day, 28 days a month for over 2 years.
I was beaten unmercifully by the Mitsubishi guards and had my back broken in a mine when one of the guards ran a car carrying the mine operator.
I'm Frank Bigelow, formerly Seaman Second Class. I'm now 78 years old. Exotic diseases and starvation couldn't kill us. Neither could 2 years of slave labor, being beaten, nearly beheaded by the masters we were forced to serve. It is that strength that brings me here today. Justice is long overdue for the thousands of World War II veterans. Excuse me.
What happened is that the Japanese had us surrender, but the Corregidor had not surrendered, and they were anxious to get Corregidor, so they wanted to get us out of there as soon as they could, so they could set up their artillery and start firing on Corregidor, and causing them to surrender. And so they made this infamous march, and so consequently they weren't prepared for it, and neither were we. And they just didn't have any food for us. They had no transportation for us.
They marched us to the road, which was about 1 kilometer, maybe 1.5 kilometers, from our bivouac area to the main road, which was right near Marvelas, where the surrender took place. And we sat there, I guess, for 6 or 7 hours. We're not allowed to talk. Had to sit there and just wait. And the way we were taken from our camp is the way we walked. If you had a hat, you had a hat. If you had a canteen, you had a canteen. If you didn't have a hat, you didn't have a hat during the march, unless you took one off of one of the dead ones. And they didn't give us a chance to take anything. And then all of a sudden the march started. We had no idea what it was.
They lined us up in groups of 400 really, 4 abreast and 100 men long. Early on, a guy would start to drop out. We didn't know what to think about it. We'd try to help the guy, and boy, there'd be a bayonet right at your back. A lot of Jap hollering, and so we knew right away that we were in for a bad time.
It was a real hardship to be walking. At first, we went up quite a grade getting out of there. And by the time I got to the top of that, some of the men that weren't in too good a shape had already dropped out. And it was really a mess, because like I say, they would be bayoneted if they didn't get up and go. And the guy guard come along with his bayonet on his rifle. And if they didn't get up and go, when he poked them a little bit, just push it through them unceremoniously. And he'd wipe off his bayonet on their clothes, and then that's it. Off he'd go.
To understand the abject cruelty visited upon the American soldier on the Bataan Death March, one needs to understand the Code of Bushido. That's the warrior code. During World War II, there were very few Japanese soldiers who surrendered, because if they did, they were considered a coward, and their names were blotted out from the records in Japan. So when the American soldiers were surrendered by their leaders, the Japanese looked at the American soldier not as fellow combatants, fellow warriors, but as dogs who were not entitled to any humane treatment.
This one man dropped out of line because he had a malaria attack. He most probably was burning up and shaking. And the Japanese wanted him to get up, and he couldn't get up. And the Japanese took 2 men out of line and had them dig a hole. And they dug the hole. When they got through digging the hole, the Japanese said to the 2 men, "Take this man and put him in the hole. We're gonna." And the 2 men said, "I can't. He's alive. I can't put him in the hole." So the Japanese took his gun and shot one of them. Called 2 more men out and said, "Dig another hole. Now bury this man. We already knew what's going to happen. You say no, you're going to be killed. So you take this man who's breathing, who's still alive, and you put him in the hole. And you throw dirt on him while he starts to scream because he knows he's alive. And you either do that or you're dead. The next guy, we'll kill as many as necessary. You're going to do what I said." That's how the Japanese attitude.
That evening, they put us in a grassy area, and we sit with our knees, our hands around our knees, with your head leaned on your knees, just as tight as you could be, and that's where we spent the night. You weren't allowed to move. When we put us on the march in the morning, the second day out, it was the same thing as the day before. And of course, by this time, guys had become desperate for water. And there were springs all along the highway, the road. And the guys would break the road. A lot of boys got shot, bayoneted. But you become desperate to the point that you just don't care. You've got to have it. That some of us, or most of us, of course, just kept on going, shuffling along.
They shoved us at San Fernando. This was the end of about a 61 mile or 90 kilometer march. Everybody was in rundown condition. They shoved us in metal box cars. There was, and we were put in like sardines. You couldn't sit down, and people were doing what people do inside box cars, and had to go to the bathroom. There was no place to go, and it seemed like it took a long time, but it was 26 miles, and they shut the doors, and there was suffocation going on. It was miserable conditions, and when we got to the end of the line, there was another about a 6 mile or 6 kilometer, I'm not sure which, march into the camp. And when I got into the camp, people were dying around me. There was, I had been down in Tijuana, and you can smell death. And I said, if I stay here, I'm dead for sure.
Camp O'Donnell was really a terrible place. There was a very minimum amount of water. You stood in, the time you were in there, you had to stand in line daily to get your canteen filled. And then they closed Camp O'Donnell, and they moved us into Cabana de Juan. Now, Cabana de Juan was a Philippine Army base, and we had better housing, bamboo stuff, but it was good. But we had plenty of water.
In the first prison camp in O'Donnell, we lost a lot of men because they were sick and they wanted a cigarette. Oh, how I remember those. And they took their one ration of rice, which was lousy. It was lagoo. It was made with so much water, it was like a mush. And the guy would take a look at this mush and he'd say, "I want a cigarette. I'll trade my mush for a cigarette." And you could talk to him about, "You have to eat it, you have to eat it." "I don't want it. I want a cigarette." And that's when I found out that cigarette kills. Because he would get a cigarette, give his rice away, next day he would do the same thing, and the third day he would die.
The case we handled against these Japanese corporations got rather interesting. We filed the lawsuit. The companies never denied that they used the men for slave labor. There was no denial about how much money was owed. You're talking about billions of dollars that are going to change. The legal case gets a little complicated. We filed over 11 cases in state and federal court. They got consolidated and they worked their way through the system. What finally happened is we got a ruling from the highest court that our case would not go forward. Well, we knew at the beginning of the case that if for some reason that happened, that we'd turn to Congress and we get Congress to do something to rectify the wrong.
We were lobbying heavily in both the Senate and the House throughout this entire process over a 3 or 4 year period. The first thing we did was get a resolution from both the House and the Senate that passed almost unanimously in both houses, and it was a sense of Congress resolution. These are our veterans. They were enslaved wrongfully, and we owe it to them to give them help.
We thought that that was going to be loudly heard in these companies, but instead they kept sort of ignoring it and hoping it would go away. And I think because they knew that the State Department was going to back them up, they had some ability to not respond. So the next round was legislation which directly addressed the key parts of the treaty that the U.S. State Department, and again, we believe that they were working on behalf of the Japanese government and Japanese companies as well. But there were two key parts of the treaty which we said, this allows these cases to go forward. The response was, no, they're barred. Well, when you looked back at the treaty history, there was one key section where it was clear that it had been changed to allow POWs from the Netherlands in Indonesia and other places to pursue claims. Then the next round of very heavy-handedness happened in the fall of 2001. We had a victory of sorts on the eve of September 11th. I was actually at work late on the night of September 10th. The last vote of the day in the Senate was a vote on a measure which barred the State Department and the Department of Justice from using any of their federal funds to oppose these claims in court. It was an effort by our team that not everybody agreed with the strategy, but it was an effort that went forward to try and block the intervention by the State Department and the Department of Justice in these cases in the California courts. And it passed by an overwhelming vote in the House, passed by an overwhelming vote in the Senate, identical language, word for word, on an appropriations bill. It went to the House-Senate conference, and 99.9% of the time when identical language passes both houses, especially by an overwhelming vote, it comes out of the conference committee unchanged. About 2 months later, we found out that the language had been completely struck from the bill. And we couldn't believe it. And in fact, some of the senators who were real institutionalists, who had not even supported the proposal because they didn't like to tie the hands of the agencies, told us they could not believe how much pressure they got from the federal government. This was from the Bush administration, from the State Department and others to take out this provision. And they were forced to do so. So again, we saw that, in my opinion, U.S.-Japan relations were given a priority over what should have been done for these soldiers.
So then we went back to Senator Hatch and Senator Biden and the members of Congress, and we helped draft a bill that would give each survivor a certain amount of money and paid for by the American government. Now, why the American government? Because if the American government, through the treaty that the men had no voice in, took their right to sue away, then that's an unconstitutional taking under the Fifth Amendment. It became known as the Bataan Death March. Now, to understand how bad it was, let's do some arithmetic. It was 84 miles. And if you take the number of American soldiers and Filipino soldiers who died on this march and divide it into 84 miles, you had a dead body every 30 feet for 84 miles. Now, let me just give you a couple of statistics. If you were captured in Europe by the Germans, 3% of the American soldiers died in captivity, 3%. If you were captured by the Japanese and they had control of you, 33% died in captivity.
The first week or two, we would take maybe 60, 70 guys a day over to the hospital area. And probably 90% of those guys died. And the burial detail for anybody, again, that had the guts to do it, you didn't have the desire, but they would give you a biscuit, an extra biscuit. And so I volunteered for burial details, and we would bury 40, 50 guys every day.
Well, in Bataan, we were working on a farm here and trying to raise some food and stuff. It was hard work, and a lot of the men were dying off, and I was in pretty good shape, and I was on many burial details. At first, when we were there doing that, we laid them all nice side by side and nice and even, and laid them out real orderly. But as time went on, the holes weren't near as deep because the men were weaker and couldn't dig the hole so deep. And the rainy season came on. Sometimes they'd dig the hole in the rain and there'd be water in there, and it was a big mess. And so we got to where we were just throwing them in, and we did it. We buried them naked because we had to keep their clothes because they didn't issue us any clothes. And we'd boil them in a 55-gallon barrel over a bonfire just to sterilize them and then use them again, the clothes. One day I had a hold of the wrists of a dead person, and another fellow had his feet, and we were swinging him over into the hole, and the skin on his wrist came off in my hands. That's how bad that body was. It was really a gruesome experience.
As I talked to my clients and learned of their personal histories, one thing stood out in my mind. Faith really did play a role in their survival, whether it was the Jewish prayer book for Lester Tenney, whether they were the Christian prayers of the Protestants, or for Harold Poole, it was the finding of the Bible that helped save his life.
Things looked pretty bleak and everything, and we were praying for help, and I prayed very sincerely for help. And I thought, gee, well, it sure would be nice to have some scriptures, the Bible, and be able to read some scriptures, and things like that. And so sure enough, this was an amazing thing that happened. One day I was up at this field hospital, and we were just coming out of there to go back down to our thing. And they spread us out through the jungle to look for other stuff. And we were going along, and I found this little book, and it was the Bible. It had the Old and New Testament in it, and it was just laying right on the ground in the jungle among the leaves and the vines and stuff, not on a trail. It was just laying there. And I found that, and quickly I put that in my pocket and brought it on back with me. Oftentimes when we come back from these foraging expeditions where we were bringing back all of this metal and stuff that they wanted, they'd line us up and inspect us because they were afraid we might find a pistol. We'd been fighting in this area for 4 months, They'd line us up, and we'd have to take off all our clothes and lay them right on the ground in front of us, stand there naked. Then they'd go through our clothes. How are you going to hide anything? This is what happened to me. Well, my Bible was taken many, many times. I'll never know how many. At every place I went, and even in Japan when I got to Japan. And what a great blessing it was. I believe it helped save my life, actually more than once, because of the encouragement that is in that Bible. And the Apostle Paul said, we glory in tribulations, and tribulations work with patience, and they make us more teachable. And he really went on saying how tribulations were a good thing. And so this is the thing that, one of the main things that really gave me great encouragement from reading these scriptures.
Starting as early as 1942, private Japanese corporations began requesting of the military that Allied prisoners be sent to Japan so they could be used as slave laborers.
They started taking out guys out of Command 1, that anybody that could walk, really. And I was one of the first groups that they took out. There was, I don't know, probably 200 or 300 of us lined up, and all you allowed to take with was your canteen and what you had on. They took us to Manila and put us in the warehouse in Manila. We sit there for 2 days with nothing but 1 can of water per day. And they put us on a freighter down in the hold. And when they put us in the hold, we had to stand And when the last guys came down the ladder, they couldn't be squeezed in while they closed the hold. And we were on that. They said it's only 4 or 5 days to Formosa, so you can take anything. We were on that thing for 38 days. As far as torture or whatever you want to call it, that was probably the worst part of the entire POW period that I spent. Guys went crazy. We got a canteen of water a day and a bowl of rice every other day. And it's something you don't want to think about. The odor got to the point where you didn't notice it. You know, at first, boy, oh boy, what a smell. They did pass buckets around for to use the toilet, but not near enough. And of course, we were sitting on coal covered with straw, or standing on coal covered with straw. And you just, if you had to go, if you had to have a bowel movement, if you couldn't stoop down, you just went. And I guess, maybe a terrible thing to say, but maybe it's a good thing you didn't have so much food. But I remember going 3 or 4 days not having a bowel movement. And of course, kidneys hardly moved at all. And you sweat till it got to the point where there was no moisture in your body to come out.
All the time we slept on a board floor without a mattress. They didn't have any mattresses wherever we slept. And as we were losing weight, that's what we were every day. Now, I weighed 180 pounds when I was at myself in my good shape before the war. I was exercising and keeping in good shape. And I got down to 97 pounds. But in the meantime, when you lose that much weight and you try to sleep on a board floor, you don't have any meat to cushion you between your skin and your bones, and it is bad. You can't lay in one position very long. You wake up and turn over, and you don't have a good solid night's sleep.
These freighter ships carrying the POWs to Japan would later become known, for obvious reasons, as hell ships. It's estimated that over 50,000 Allied prisoners made the trip by hell ship to Japan during the war, and over 21,000 of these men died from suffocation, starvation, sickness, and exhaustion, where they were killed by an Allied torpedo or bomb.
When we got to fresh air, it was, you really couldn't describe it. When they opened the hold, you could, all of a sudden things changed. The air changed just that quick, and it couldn't have been, but it did, just by looking, just by seeing the sun. So it's something you don't really think about. You don't want to remember it. I try not to, and I don't. I'll go for months and not even think about it.
After we lost in court, and after we made our first attempt with legislation, a lot of people on the legal team thought that we had no options. And so different people slowly shut down the operation in their office. I felt that there was a possibility of getting something through because we had some very powerful people in Congress that believed in the case. One in particular is Congressman Duncan Hunter, who at the time was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the House. I personally went and met with Congressman Hunter, and in his office late at night, he and I, with his staff, drafted a bill. And I can remember sitting there with Congressman Hunter, and I said, Congressman, make sure that in this bill that there is nothing about compensation for the attorneys. I don't want anything to block this bill, and nobody in the legal team wants any compensation. We just want the right thing to be done. And I really thought we had an opportunity to get that through. But it never did. It never made it.
Sometimes justice isn't fair. And, obviously that's a subjective term, and one person's fairness is not another person's unfairness, or et cetera. But this struck me as a classic example where every lawyer in every court and every treaty interpreter might have been doing his or her job, but in some, a gross unfairness was happening.
We all started out with a lot of optimism. By the end, I think many of us were just really disappointed in our own government, that even the most modest effort to have the U.S. government pay something we could not succeed at doing. We even tried to get a memorial for the POWs, and we couldn't even get that through Congress.
The United States is one place that has always recognized, since its inception, the importance of individual rights. And here we had a situation where I believe our government very dishonestly decided to deny those individual rights to the POWs.
When they arrived in Japan, the men would be sent to different companies in different locations. Harold Poole was sent to work at the Nippon Steel Mill, while Lester Tenney was taken to the Mitsui coal mines.
No, we had no idea what we were going to do until we were taken down into the coal mine that first day. And it was a real wake-up experience because none of us had ever been in a coal mine before. The coal mine that we went into was a mine that was closed in 1936 because all the coal that was safe to take out had been taken out. And we walked down and we were given a G-string. All we wore was a pair of rubber shoes and a G-string. We worked 12 hours a day for 3 years, almost 3 years.
In this steel mill, we had some military people that marched us down to the mill about 2 miles every morning, and then they turned us over to the civilian workers at the steel mill. Now, the civilian workers, none of them carried guns, but they did have clubs, and they used those clubs. They were as big as a ball bat and usually kind of curved like a stick off of a tree. But anyway, that was what they used with us and all the time we were prisoners of war in the various places.
We were beaten on a daily basis. Anytime the Americans won a sea battle, anytime the Americans won a land battle, the Japanese in the coal mine would beat us. And how would they beat us? With shovels, pickaxes, hammers, chains, never with their hands.
It was basically slave labor. We had to work long hours and sometimes 10 hours a day, and we had a break at noon, and the mill served us some soup, which was a little bit better than what they had up at the camp, but at least we were thankful we could get that. And then we go back to the camp at night. The soldiers would take us back again, military. And oftentimes they would drill us up and down the road before they let us go into our barracks to end the day, sometimes another 20, 30, 40 minutes. Whenever a person got where he couldn't work that day or sick or something, they would cut his rations in half. We weren't getting enough already, and this wasn't the thing to do. When a person was sick, he needed probably more nourishment than what he was getting instead of less.
It's so hard to describe being beaten. It's so hard to describe that in order to prevent going to work in the coal mine, we would break an arm, we would break a leg. We had one man who had his collarbone broken. Now, I'm talking about having it broken on purpose. I'm talking about taking a piece of iron and breaking your own arm, or having a buddy break your arm for you, or break a leg or cut off a toe, anything to get out of work. And that's what was happening. Anything to get out of work. Until about the I guess it was the 8th of August, when we were able to see this tremendous cloud rise, heard an explosion, looked in that direction, and we saw this cloud rise, just like a mushroom. We found out later that it was the atomic bomb at Nagasaki. We were only 32 miles from Nagasaki.
Went out to work one day, and they said no work today. The next day, no more work today. And bombers were coming, big fleets by this. The next day come in, told us the war was over. Really no shouting or hollering anything. Everybody just kind of went their own way, walked off by themselves, and some guys cried, carried on, but it worked out. And I guess a couple days later, they started dropping food to us, and then they dropped tons of us. And I gained 21 pounds in 23 days. Well, everybody else did. Had all we wanted to eat.
When we got back to Manila, we were on, they gave us new clothes, deloused us, and fed us 24/7.
In fact, on that destroyer, they gave us a dinner, and I'll never forget that. Mashed potatoes, brown gravy, pork chops, and real butter on our rolls and stuff, and it was really great. And pie and ice cream for dessert. When we got to the Golden Gate Bridge, they had a great big sign on the bridge, "Welcome home." And then there was we called it a Zeppelin in those days, flying overhead, and it had a big sign, "Well done" on it, you know. We were heroes. We weren't cowards anymore, you know. And this was wonderful because we had been called cowards so long in the prison camp.
First, they had warned us not to talk about our treatment, but it got to the point where they really couldn't stop it. So they spill your beans if you want to, so most of us did. I ended up in Cambridge, Ohio. Was about 70 miles from my home. And my folks came down the next day. And I got home for Christmas in 1945. I've been a happy person ever since.
When the plane landed there, my family was all there, and they had this like gate closed and all that, and they pushed a portable stairway up to the plane where I got off from, and 2 or 3 of them got ahead of me. But when I came out, and my folks saw me, my mother busted through that gate and ran out and grabbed me and hugged me, and oh, that was wonderful to have my mother in my arms again, you know, after 5 years, you know.
One of the hardest things for me to deal with, and I'm sure this is true with a lot of men, one of the hardest things is when we have to say, why me? Why did I come home? It's a hard thing. I had friends that were great kids, great people, great background, wonderful education. They didn't make it.
I think back, probably maybe as much as 90% of the whole thing was mental. And if a guy said he wanted to die, guys would come in off of work detail, so I'm not going back out there tomorrow. And they'd be dead.
When I was in the prison camp, I know there was one day when we were sitting around some chairs inside of this barracks type place, and there was a man that walked across the floor and to their side, and he sat down on an empty bench. 5 minutes later, he dropped over dead. Well, he gave up. He could walk physically enough across, and when he sat down, he just gave up and just keeled over. That's how fast that can go. Now, there are some of them that, and I don't know, I don't have any figures or anything, but I would say there's a certain percent of them that gave up early on and didn't make it, especially when they had things wrong with them, you know, and all that. But basically, the majority of us were hardcore enough that we wanted to live and put up with whatever we had to do so. And that's probably why those of us that are alive are still here, is because of that determination to want to live and to make the grade, you know. Never at any time when I was a prisoner of war did I ever desire or even thought about, hey, it would be nice if I could just die now. Not me. No, that didn't come into my mind one bit. I wanted to make it no matter what. I'd go through anything, which I did.
Unfortunately, you know, our veterans now, our World War II veterans are now 10 years older since we started the fight. They're all up in their mid-80s. And they're dying, you know, every day.
It's been amazing to all of us how willing these men have been to pursue these claims. You know, they could have just stayed silent. They could have just gone on with their lives. But I think the folks, particularly the men who were most engaged in this, really felt like the history books needed to know about this, that companies should not get away with this. And they, as soldiers, really believed in their country.
Just being around those great old soldiers who suffered so much was really an uplifting thing for me. And I think to everybody else who had the privilege of hearing them testify and of knowing what they went through. It was something. And you know, they really weren't interested in the money. They were interested in the recognition of how badly they were treated and a recognition by those companies that they really did wrong.
It is not money that motivates us. It is a need to remind the world of the importance of basic human rights and dignity. A wrong is a wrong no matter how many people are doing it. This is not a tirade against Japan as a nation. I have no animosity towards the Japanese people. However, I and my colleagues who have served the United States and fought in Bataan are entitled to compensation and an apology from the Japanese companies that enslaved.
I am here today to speak not only for myself, but for all those young men who never came home. So what I simply ask today, Mr. Chairman, is for your aid and assistance in helping us right this wrong. If the United States is not going to support us, then for heaven's sakes, they should not oppose us. I have confidence and trust in our American system of justice.
The primary thing I'm looking for, sir, is justice. But I would like to say, the thing I think that should happen in this country more than anything else is that our children and our young people should be taught what happened and why it happened. And maybe the future leaders of our country won't make this same mistake.
Those of us interned by Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Nippon, Ishihara, Sangyo, and many other Japanese companies suffered our own Holocaust, and this has never been recognized.
And in closing, may I say, protect your freedom and your flag with your life if it's necessary. It's the most important thing any American will ever have.
So you might ask me, Mr. Parkinson, if you had that great victory in the tobacco case and you settled it for $200 billion, that's got to be the highlight of your career. Why don't you talk to us about that? That kind of makes you look good. Why are you talking about the case that you lost, which ought to be an embarrassment? Well, the reason I'm talking to you about that case is because I think that you need to hear about it. So the only justice that these men are ever going to see, they didn't get it in the courts, didn't get it in Congress, is if people like you hear the story and learn something from it.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
I recall a quote by Mother Teresa where she said that nobody comes into your life by accident. Either you're supposed to do something for them or they're supposed to do something for you. As I watch and listen and hear about my former clients passing away, I'm steeled in my soul with a conviction that I have the responsibility now And as long as I can take a breath, and as long as I can gather an audience, I'm going to tell their story. Because I know that if I tell the story correctly, that Harold Poole and Lester Tenney and the others will have the same impact on the people I speak to that they had on me. That we will all want to become better people. That we will all understand the sacrifices that have been made to make us free. And that truly, when John F. Kennedy spoke and said that the torch had been passed, he was talking not to that audience of that day, but he was talking to the eternities.